Welcome to our second episode of Association Nation. Thank you to all the listeners that joined us during our first episode in Spanish, where we talk about the insurance on the association. During the second episode, we are going to be talking about budgets and finances of the associations. And today, I'm honored to be joined by our Director of Operations, Oscar Borges, and by Luis Lavandeira, CPA. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
We decided to do this second episode on budgets because we're about to start budgeting season, where most of the associations are going to prepare the budget for 2020. And this can be a difficult task if you don't have the tools or necessary support to do this process. We asked our followers in social media at Renovations PM what questions they had on budgets. And one of the most common, and with the one that I want to start this conversation, was who is in charge of creating and approving the budget of the association?
So I think that is a great question because most often, at least from my experience at budget meetings, there's typically a general misconception on who's responsible for approving, well, first and foremost, preparing the budget and then ultimately approving it. The short answer to that question is the board of directors. So as we all know, those of us that work in this industry or live in associations, every year there is a democratic process as to where a board is elected. Those individuals at that moment when they are elected, they are given the responsibility to uphold the documents of the association. And within those documents, there's typically language that states that a budget should be prepared and presented to the ownership on an annual basis. Obviously, there's more of a technical process that's involved with that, and I'm sure that Luis will be able to get into that a little bit later in the podcast. But it's the board of directors. That's the short and long answer, I guess, to the question.
Within the same idea, when they're doing the process, is a budget committee needed?
So, from the management side, I always recommend, if you've got volunteers that are willing to participate in the process, absolutely. I think that the board, because it's a position that doesn't, it's not a paid position, it's a volunteer position. I always recommend to our clients, at least, that if you have people that are wanting to participate, it's great because it gives you more perspective. It allows you to look at the budget from different points of views, not only from the board as the partial operator to the association, but also from the people that are being impacted by that budget. Absolutely, committees are always recommended.
We as CPA, we always recommend committees. It adds transparency. The more individuals you have within the association involved in the process, the better it's going to be at the time. The board needs to explain why the assessments. So we fully recommend finance committee, budget committees, so on and so forth.
So getting into more about the mathematics behind the budget, how does the board or the management or the CPA involved calculate the assessment for during the budget process? Or
so as part of the there's a lot of talk on what comes first, and we always say even prior to getting to do budgeting, the board should meet with the management company and the manager and go through the financials and get an understanding of the financial position of the association, so that any adjustments to the budgets are discussed prior to working on the actual figures for the subsequent year. Once that is done, then the management team will go through the contracts. We'll go through every specific line item in the existing budget and come up with adjustments for non-recurring items within those financials. Once the management team goes through all the expenses, including the one that have never been part of the financials, let's just use the example, and I'm sure you're going to have a question on that, the bad debt expenses. Once the board goes through the financial and they decide that there are the unit owners that might not pay the assessment because they have not done in the past, so that's a line item that most associations fail to include in the budget, because obviously the more expenses you have, the higher the maintenance fee will be. So once you go through all the expenses, then you get to work on your revenues. Most people do the opposite, but the budget should be approached bottom up. You work on the expenses, Then you get to your revenues. And once you have your revenues, you're going to use your prior financials, your prior CPA report, and obviously the management input. Once you get to that, you are in a position of calculating the assessments. Some associations have that divided by percentage of ownership. Some other associations have it as a flat rate of the lots. It depends on the condo docs. Oscar, you want to chip in?
Yeah. So I think just taking a step back, the question of preparing the budget, I know that whenever we do our classes, one of the things that we always tell newly elected board members or residents that are interested in understanding how this process works is preparing your budget starts on the first day of the new budget. And what does that mean for us? As management, one of the things that we always encourage our PMs, make sure I get that right, is that, contracts, invoices, that information is always readily available and updated, right? That we don't have to, at the end of the year, start, seeking out contracts and requesting them, because that could slow down the process and it could make it far less efficient. So, from our end, we want to make sure that contracts are always updated, that the most recent invoices, that are uncontested are readily available, because that really gives you a snapshot of what your current expenses are, both from a routine, reoccurring perspective, as well as from a trending analysis point of view. So, looking at, what your general maintenance and repairs expenses have been for the last 6 months, right? So you may identify that there's expenses in there that were one-offs, things that are not likely to happen again, like the breakdown of equipment, et cetera. Or you may see that there's a reoccurring issue with your maintenance. So you've got ongoing roof leaks, which may say to you, hey, in your budget this year, let's not continue to inflate this number. Let's treat the problem at the root cause. We need to really look at, consider a special assessment to treat a certain element in the property. So we're looking at it from a more personal, right, knowledge base of where the expenses are coming from and how they were generated. And I think that that's something that oftentimes gets lost when you're putting a budget together, because it's not just throwing the numbers in there saying this is how much we need to spend to run the organization. It's, how did we get to these numbers? What caused these expenses to generate?
I think there is an important number that some communities vote to take out of the budget, but I learned actually from Luis a phrase that I want to repeat. A reserve means if you don't have a reserve now, it means that you should have a special assessment at some point. So I want to get into the reserve now, about a little bit, if we can discuss a little bit about the reserve in the association, the importance and how to calculate reserves.
So, but at the same time that associations, I want to believe that they do a great homework when it comes to the operating budget. I see a significant amount of significant number of associations that they fail to do the same with the reserve. And when I say with the reserve, I mean with the capital items, however the definition, people want to believe. It's some people say it's capital items, some people refer to those as reserve expenses. Anyhow, the association should rely on a reserve study, and this used to be somehow expensive. They're not. There's a lot of engineering companies in the market that offer these reserve studies. The reserve study is the guide for the associations to start talking about reserves. It's going to give you a projection. It's going to give you the life of your capital items, when the study is done, and that's going to help the board to assist in the process of recommending having reserves or not. Most studies present the reserves in both ways, straight line and the pooled funding. The straight line is pretty straightforward. It's a mathematical formula, and you have the cost of the item, and then you have the life expectancy, and it's divided, and it provides the funding on an annual basis. The pooled takes into account, and the engineers provide this in the study, the projection of how the expenses might occur, and then they give you the study with all the components within the association, and so the board ultimately is the one deciding if adding that 100% recommendation by the engineers, or half of that, or whatever percentage the board decides that is the most convenient for the association. Obviously, the board is the one that knows the demographics. The board is the one that is taking the position to present to the association what's in their perspective, what should be the funding of the reserves. Now, how large the reserve should be, it depends, and I know that most people don't like that answer, but it depends, Is your approach a long term, or is your approach, a short term? Obviously, the professionals in the industry, we say, if you don't have reserves, you're automatically voting for special assessments. And we see it, Oscar and I, we go to meetings and we get the same questions, and we see associations asking why, and then we have to take them back to private financials and say, well, you have been waiving reserves for the last 5 years, so you don't have any funds for these items, so obviously you're going to have to need now a special assessment. Most special assessments obviously are not welcomed, but in my experience, every time I see a special assessment, it's either because the board failed to have proper reserves, or because they failed at having a reserve study to help them to project and take the needs and start budgeting for those with enough time so that you had a better chance of avoiding the special assessment. Do you think, Oscar?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most important roles the manager plays, particularly when it comes to the reserve lines, is managing expectations. So oftentimes I see that those items are manipulated to control per unit expenditure or per unit maintenance fees, and that's a poor way of managing. I think that when I say managing expectations is, from a management's perspective, you need to have that candid conversation with your board and eventually with the community and say, hey, listen, going back to what you said, we waive reserves today, we special assess tomorrow, because eventually the money has to come from somewhere. And with time, elements deteriorate. That's a proven fact. Whether you live in a condominium or you live in an HOA in a single family home, with time, you have to paint, you have to redo your roofs, you have to do your roads. And that's just a very basic example of the things that deteriorate with time. Some properties have more complex infrastructure, items such as elevators or pump rooms, fire suppression systems, and all of these things with time, they require financial resource, and if you're not properly prepared for the long term, then it's gonna represent big numbers in the short term from each owner. And I think that when you have those, from experience, when you have those conversations at budget, when you have that conversation at budget time, and it's not a simple or a very quick, well, this is the budget and this is how we got the numbers and that's it. When you, as a manager or as a board, because it's a dual role, right? That's played. When you take the time to educate the ownership and say, hey, listen, this is why we're doing what we're doing, and here's an in-depth explanation so that you understand, why it is that we want to either partially fund the reserves, or why, hey, we're pushing to fully fund the reserves, etc. When you have that detailed conversation with the ownership, you're more likely to get them to reason with you. I think it's also, going back to managing expectations, I think it's unrealistic, because what ends up happening with a lot of associations, and I think Luis could attest to this, they fail to properly fund reserves for so long that once a board comes around and says, hey, let's do the right thing. Let's establish these these long-term expense accounts so that we don't have to take those big hits to our pockets down the road. We're talking about repairing or replacing elements next year. So funding a reserve from one year to another, or not from one year to another, in a 5-year span for a roof replacement, we're talking about significant increases to maintenance. So it's almost better at that point to say, let's just do a special assessment. So I think there's a balance. I think that it requires a lot more detail than just saying, let's control the maintenance payment, or you have to look at it with great detail. And I find that that's most often not the case in a lot of associations.
What Oscar mentioned is key, because the board, in an attempt to keep the maintenance the same as the prior year, they will manipulate information such as the recommendations of an engineer for funding of the reserve. And in doing so, yes, they will keep the maintenance fee low, but they are failing at saving for those elements that a professional came in, did the inspection, the testing, and gave you a report saying these line items have a life expectancy of, let's just use 3 to 1 year. So you know that most likely you're going to have to replace those elements within 1, 2, and 3 years. So playing with the funding of the reserve to keep the maintenance at a certain level, it's going to come back to you pretty soon, and then you're not going to have enough time to fund those needs. And what's going to happen is the unwelcome phrase, the special assessment, and then you're going to have a hard time explaining to the membership why you need a special assessment, because someone might question your management style. Someone might say, why didn't we fund for that element for the last 3 or 4 years? We have seen it. We go to meetings and we get those questions. Some people even say, I don't want to have reserves because then it's going to be spent. I don't want to have fund reserves because it's going to be, utilized for something else. And, we as CPA, we tell them, if you have sufficient internal controls, if you have your monthly financial reports, if you get involved, if you go to the meetings, if you have a close relationship with your management company / your management team and your accountant, that is not going to happen. We are involved in a lot of fraud cases, and 99% of the time, it doesn't happen when the membership is really involved.
Right.
If you go to meetings, you participate. If you request those monthly financial reports, if you read those, if you ask the questions, that most likely that's not going to happen. So it shouldn't be an excuse not to fund reserves, because the membership is afraid that the funds will be used for a different purpose.
Yeah, I could tell you that one of the biggest mistakes, because I get asked that question a lot, like, what if we establish these reserves, what controls could we put in place so that down the line they're not spent on other expenses that are not related to the original intent of the reserve? And my answer always to board and to my managers is, look, number one, if you want to prevent inappropriate spending, you limit discretionary spending across the board. Oftentimes I see discretionary spending taking place within budgets where items are not budgeted for. The board saying, well, let's buy a water cooler, or there's no water cooler. Where do we define that in the budget, right? So we want to create a culture in the association where you're limiting discretionary spending, where you're creating inclusion. So we talked about committees. That's a big deal. If you've got committees, if you've got a third party outside of the board, outside of the manager, looking at spending, looking at how these reserves are being funded, right? Whether or not they're being funded, whether if they're not being funded, are we creating deficit line items so that we could hold ourselves accountable to putting that money in there before the end of the fiscal calendar, right? It's all about creating a culture. To Luis's point, it's internal controls, but it's also creating a culture where it's not just one set of eyes looking at, these reserves and these large sums of money. And then down the line, without that culture, people thinking that money is there to be spent on whatever they feel like it. I think that's the best tool that any association could implement, that creating that culture.
Getting into a little bit more of the process of approving the budget, can you tell us about how many days does the board need to send out the notice of the budget meeting? What happens during the budget meeting? Are owners encouraged to participate on that, or is only for the board?
So, notice requirements for meetings, I always tell clients and our managers, you always need to refer to the documents. There are different notice requirements for meetings in different types of associations. As a general benchmark, you can use a 14-day rule where a budget notice should be sent out to the ownership along with the proposed budget, no less than 14 days. But prior to using that rule, always go back to the documents, particularly the bylaws, and see if there's any language in there that has more stringent notice requirements. Aside from the budget meeting, I think that it's important that, I spoke a little bit about spending time on the budget and really going into detail as to the information in there being accurate to the expenses and the incomes of the association. With that said, I think that a community that has a successful budget has not only had a budget meeting, but they've also had budget planning meetings or workshops prior to or leading up to the meeting. So once that meeting takes place, no one in the room or very little people in the room are surprised by any of the information that's being discussed.
And that's where you actually really get that feedback from the membership. You start talking about, the expectations and the management team can explain, that in the subsequent year they wanna tackle certain things that they have been put to the side, but now the decision is in a better financial position and they are ready to include that in the budget. So when we go to those meetings, and people always ask the questions because they look at the CPA and they think that the CPA has all the answers, and in actuality, the answers are within the association, within the board members and the membership, because they are the ones that are living in that association. I can come to you and explain to you what I have seen in my last 19 years in the industry and all the associations that I see from the Keys to Orlando, and no association is similar to the next. So, when I go to one meeting and sometimes we have 2 meetings in the same day, and I sit with the financials and the budgets, and the conversation is 180 degrees, it's totally different because, Association A, it's really into savings and being conservative and approaching everything on time and taking care of the capital items and the reserves and always with committees. And then you go to Association B and nobody wants to fund reserves, nobody wants to go to the meetings, and it's a total disconnect between the membership and the management team. And that's when we see most of the issues, when we see that disconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that one of the things that I'm going to just jump the gun here, but I'm looking at your notes, Joanna, and I know that one of the questions that you had for us was what type of questions owners should ask at meetings, and I think that is a phenomenal question.
Don't you love when they say, why is maintenance fee going up?
Why? So
that should be the first question in your mind. And I always say, didn't your FP&L went up? Didn't your insurance go up? So magically, you cannot expect that the expenses of the association did not go up unless you have a signed contract, And obviously, you have to read the language and you have to see if there's any increases allowed within that document. Obviously, everything else is an art. You have to estimate. You have to look at your prior financials. You have to look at your prior audit report. You have to, see it. You have to discuss. You have to analyze. You have to project. That's where your Excel worksheet tool comes into place. And once you do that, that's when you're really in a position to talk about maintenance. But if you do that, if you do those meetings, if people come in and they participate, you're not going to have that lovely question of why is my maintenance going up.
Right. And I think that the question, because piggybacking off of that, the question should, in my opinion, and when I say my opinion, I'm speaking from the perspective of once being on a board, as well as once being an owner within an association, and also now obviously working in this industry as a manager. The question should never be why. In my opinion, why is too ambiguous. You're not being specific. If you're asking someone in management or on a board, and why a particular line item is increasing year over year, the question should not be why. I feel that the question should be more more so to the point. It should be presented differently. It should be what drove your decision to increase this line item from X to Y? How did we get to that number? What was the driving factor behind the increase? And it doesn't have to be stated that way. But what you want to get to, in my opinion, is the mindset. How was it that we determined that, general maintenance and repair? And I bring that up often because it's one of the lines that fluctuates year over year because there's a lot of potential for discretionary spending in there. But you want to ask, how did we get to that number? Could you give me an outline of what expenses we took on this year, and how is it that we're projecting to see that increase next year, right? Those are the questions you want to ask respectfully, because in the end of the day, the people that are sitting on the board side or on the management side, they're not just making you pay more because they feel like it. They're seeing that there's a need to increase the operational budget of the association to have operational continuity so that the community could function year over year without any interruptions of service or any decline in maintenance.
To continue on the specific expense that Oscar was mentioning, replacement maintenance, I just want to add that within reasonable limits, associations should consider to have within the replacement maintenance multiple accounts. We see associations with just one replacement maintenance account and then a significant variance, and it's really hard to explain what created the variance versus an association that has a replacement maintenance general account and then a replacement maintenance for supplies, a replacement maintenance plumbing, a replacement maintenance with specific line items that the management team see that are the ones that are always occurring. There's not a magical number. I cannot say to you, have 5, 10, or 11. But if the manager really knows the financials and the board is involved, and they see the invoices, they see what they're signing, they should have a solid idea of how many replacement maintenance sub-accounts to have within that budget category. It's going to be easier to explain because then I can see that my projection was on point, let's just say for my supplies and my general account, but then I can see that in plumbing we went up, let's just say 150%. Well, that's going to create a question, back to what Oscar was mentioning at the beginning. So if I see that every year I'm going up by 150%, so then let's talk about what's happening with the plumbing. Should we then look at what's really creating these variances? Are we funding enough of the research? Because most likely then this is the sign of something major that is going to happen pretty soon.
All right. Now, we've talked a lot about expenses that, I'm not going to say that you could control within an operating budget, but they're the most controllable. When you're talking about contracts, when you're talking about utilities, and you're talking about maintenance items, for the most part, there's a certain level of control. How about the items that are expense items in a budget, but are often overlooked or manipulated to reach a desired amount, such as bad debt?
Are you talking about contingency?
I'm not even going to get into that because I think we could have a whole other conversation about contingency. It's just a word that's so ambiguous. Like, if you haven't noticed, for me, discretionary spending is like the number one enemy of any budget, because it really it creates a space for people to just get so creative where they just utilize funds for the wrong reasons. But that set aside, bad debt. I think bad debt is one of the most overlooked items on a budget, and it is the most impactful because it's a line item. And Luis, I know you'll get into a little bit more detail, but it's the line item that accounts for those that didn't pay or are not expected to pay.
Not expected to pay. It's a projection, like all the line items within the budget, or if you have a signed contract, it's a projection. And yes, when we are invited prior to the approval of the budget, when there's time to still make adjustments and provide feedback, we always use the delinquency report, and we always use collection reports from the attorneys, and we can show to the management team that units X, Y, and Z that have not been paying for the last couple of years, we can show in actual numbers the cash flow that would not be present from those units. Let's just use an association with just 10 units, like the ones in the Keys. Association with 10 units, if 3 units have not been paying for the last 2 years, so now you have 30%, that you're not going to be able to achieve. So that's a really significant impact in your cash flow. So neglecting to account for that in your budget by virtue of not having that bad debt expense line item is going to put yourself in a position that you're not going to have the cash flow to go with your expenses. And there's only 2 places, You're going to be paying your invoices with tomorrow's money, with the people that, prepaid, or you're going to be dipping into the operating capital of the association, the savings from inception through that point, or what we see, the illegal use of reserve funds. When you don't have your cash flow to pay for your operating expenses, but you do have a reserve cash account, and then managers get, those funds to pay for the invoices, or they don't do the required monthly transfer to the reserves per the approved budget, and that is created because of the negative cash flow or the lack of cash flow, because you had a significant number of units not paying. And when we did the budget, we failed to include that because we wanted to continue paying the same maintenance fee that we paid in the prior year.
Right.
You see it, Oscar?
Yeah, absolutely. So I describe, because bad debt, for those that are not familiar with bookkeeping or accounting, it could come off as being a complex line item, but it really isn't. I actually describe it to my clients in the most simplest way. In its most simplest form, bad debt is best described as going out to dinner with 3 other friends and paying for that one person who didn't have money at the table. The amount that each person who pays, it represents the amount that the person who couldn't pay. That's what bad debt is. Bad debt is that it's the accumulated amounts of the person that didn't pay, because in associations,
I like that.
It's the best analogy I can
use that example when I go to dinner next time. That's a bad debt.
That's a bad debt, right? It's the best analogy I think that you could describe, because essentially, and this is where, going back to one of the first things that Luis mentioned, budgets in associations are, the best way to put them together is from the ground up. So you have to first determine the operating costs of the association or the organization, and then you work your way backward into determining the income. And when you look at it that way, it's very simple to understand what bad debt is. And once again, if you don't see it on your budget, are there other descriptions that you've seen? I typically see it as bad debt, maybe a prior year loss. No, that's something completely different, right?
That's something different. That's when the association has been incurring operating losses year after year.
It generated deficit.
And
right?
then now it's in a position that it's even holding payments of invoices. So when they work on the budget, they realize that they have to increase capital, and then they add a line item within the budget called prior year deficit funding.
Okay.
Because they met with legal, and then they decided that instead of having a special assessment to replenish the operating fund, that they were going to do it through the budget. I always, when I'm asked that question, I always say, let's get legal counsel on the phone, because there might be implications of doing option A or option B, and I can give you the pros and the cons of either of those two. But yes, that's a line item that is also going to increase your maintenance fee, because we have added another expense to go with prior year deficits.
All right.
We're close to finishing the second episode, but before we finish, I want to get this question real quick. We know that the board is the one in charge of approving the budget, but what happens if the owners, the membership, disagree with the decision?
I think that's it's a political question, right? Because
there's a legal process, and I'm gonna say the same. You're gonna have to get with your legal counsel. The membership has the option of not accepting that budget and bringing their own version of the budget, and there's a fixed number of days to do that. There's an entire legal process to do that, and that's obviously by Roscoe or I, attorneys, the association should get with legal counsel to see how that is done. But yes, the membership has the option of not, uh, um, I don't want to say approving, Oscar, because the board is the one approving the budget.
Right,
But the
to,
membership
to,
can
to have the board revisit.
disagree with that budget
Yeah.
and bring their own version. You know, we have gone to meetings together. I have been in this industry for the last 18, 19 years, I don't remember now. And I see a lot of disagreements in the meetings, but I have never seen an actual group of unit owners bring in an actual budget. Because it's really easy to disagree. It's really easy to stand up in a meeting and have your own opinion versus doing the actual budget work and being realistic. Because you can always come back with a budget of a lesser amount, but you know, at what cost? So you're not gonna have security anymore. You're not gonna have, swimming pool. You're not gonna have landscaping. So you know, then it's gonna come down to, you know, what's the impact in the value of my asset, my home, my property. So if you keep it realistic, you know, most likely there's not gonna be any difference because the board did it. Obviously, nobody wants to pay maintenance in excess. If the board did it and they come to the meeting and they present the budget with X percent of increase, they already went through the expenses. They already went through the contracts. The management team already called the vendors. So the only thing different, and I have not seen a group of unit owners doing that, would be to reduce services.
Yeah, I've never seen a group of owners present their own budget. I've seen committees challenge the board, but that's because they've been part of the process since the inception of the project or of the budget.
And that should be part of the healthy discussion.
And that should be part of the
committee,
culture.
You know, the
Right.
committee is asking the questions. The committee is taking the position, you know, because they already met with certain unit owners and they have the feedback from the unit owners.
There is a key with all the information that we discussed today. And the key is that an informed homeowner will make the best possible budget reviewer. So be sure to understand the details of your association's budget. If a board and a property manager communicates well with residents and has provided a strong and transparent leadership, the annual budget review should be simple. So our advice to all the people that is listening right now is that if you have questions about your budget, sit with your manager, sit with your board and ask the questions.
So final food for thought from a management perspective. Once again, something that I always preach to my clients and my team. We live in the most interesting of times. We have information accessible to us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A lot of the times I find that owners are a little apprehensive about attending budget meetings because their professional background may not afford them the technical knowledge to be able to participate in those conversations. But I think that that's where we begin to fail, particularly as owners in associations. Always ask questions, and even if you don't know the answer if you don't understand the answers that you're being given, write them down. Use that access to information to educate yourself, because ultimately knowledge is power. We see a lot of the times in communities that fail or have failed, it's because knowledge is restricted, or we see an ownership that's not being proactive in becoming more informed on how the community works, how the budget is put together, etc. For us, really these podcasts, as well as some of the other things that we do as outreach to the association community, is part of educating that base, because we understand that there's a direct correlation between working with an educated client who understands more specifics on how we do business and why we do things a certain way. So the challenge, or the final food for thought, is go out there and take the time of understanding, because in some cases we're talking about $1 million budgets, and not educating yourself or putting yourself in a position of knowledge is really just allowing for a small group of people in some cases to have complete control over the spending in your community. So.
And if you have more questions about the process, you can always contact us in our social media pages. We're in Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and you can ask us about the budget process, and we will happy to help you. And if you live in South Florida, we're going to have actually a budget class on September 19th. You can have the information on our social media pages at RenovationsBN or in our website, renovationsbn.com. Thank you again, Luis, for joining us. If you want to share your contact details with us, please.
Yes, prior to say that, I want to emphasize on get to know your financials, read your financials. You know when the budget season is, which for most South Florida associations is within August through mid-October. You know the time, you know your management team, get to see your financials, get to understand your financial position, ask the questions, then you will be ready to start talking about budget. Any questions, I can be emailed at L as in Luis, AVAND at grgcpa.com. I'm going to repeat it, LAVAND at grgcpa.com.
Great. Thank you again to everyone that listened to our second episode. Share this episode with your community. An informed community is a better managed community. Hear you soon.